Hi everybody, welcome to Clasheen. My name is Nicola Brown and I'm delighted to be able to share with you a little bit about my journey developing a sustainable textile practice here in rural Southeast Ireland. I know that since lockdown began in early 2020 with the advent of COVID-19 worldwide, many people felt disconnected from others, and we have a whole new set of problems at the moment that are continuing into 2021 and will also be causing issues for the foreseeable future. The International Feltmakers Association, or IFA, commissioned me to make a series of 3 videos for Reconnect. Reconnect was the theme of their 2021 AGM. The bulk of the content of this video is what I shared with their members, but I've updated and added new information from 2021 too. I hope you enjoy it. I do find that on a personal level, it makes you reflective when you have more time at home. I know that I'm very, very blessed to have a property that I love. It's taken me since the late 2000s, 2005 onwards, to develop my home, my studio, my land into the practice that it is today. But it is worthwhile. It's been a fantastic journey, and every day when I get up in the morning, I'm thankful for where I live, for what I do, and the fact that I can communicate with people online and stay in contact with my peers from the safety of my own home. So I hope you enjoy this journey. I hope that it might give inspiration to some people, and it's just really, this is life as it is. I'm not actually sure if you can even hear that there is a muck spreader in the background. I can certainly smell what is happening here, but this is a rural community that I live in, and I'm going to share with you life as it is, not life as it could be, but maybe it will inspire some of you to rethink where you live and maybe develop your own sustainability a little bit more and get some ideas for the future. Let's start at the very beginning. Here's an old image of the house as it looked before I started to renovate it. It had been used to store grain upstairs and farm machinery downstairs for quite a number of years. And here's the back where the land sloped down and was actually touching the wall. Inside the house, the kitchen, which is to the right of the front door, is the hub of the home. It always would have been. This is the large fireplace where there would have been an open fire and where the Rayburn, my range, now is. Upstairs, up the top of the stairs leading out of the kitchen, this is the room at the top of the stairs. This is now actually my dining room. And there was lime plaster everywhere, which I hacked back with a hammer and chisel myself before conservation builders came in and started the wiring and the actual renovation work. Here's one of the few photographs I have of myself taken during renovations, and this is the day that the timber sash windows went in. A friend made the windows for me, and he replicated an old window frame that we had found upstairs in the house. In this image, you can see where the land has been prepared on the right-hand side of the house for the extension, and a French drain went in at the back of the house to make sure that the land wasn't actually up against the back wall and contributing to damp. Although the extension is constructed from modern block construction, both the inside and the outside of the house are whitewashed. Here I am now in the kitchen. As you can see, it's very, well, I find it comfortable looking, but it's quite old-fashioned. It's exactly how I like it. Lime plaster on the wall, old slate on the floor. Kitchen units are made by a friend of mine, and the butcher block is actually from my butcher. The same butcher actually saves onion skins for me, which I use in the eco-printing pot. In this photo here, there are some pieces of eco-printed wool drying in front of the cooker, but I also have a second cooker. It's an old gas one that I picked up from the recycling centre, and that's where, if the weather is extremely bad, I will actually process some bundles inside in the kitchen. With my back to the cooker, I then can swing around and look at the kitchen table. It's the hub of the home, the kitchen, and this is where I do a lot of entertaining family and friends. It's also where I felt, usually in the winter, and I record smaller clips for my online workshops. I've kept things very simple upstairs too. Whitewashed walls, painted wooden floors, and you can see in the dining room, which actually does have a modern table and chairs, that I've retained the full height ceilings in the original house as well. The first trees I planted at Clasheen went in 2005 at the side of the house, a selection of old varieties of apple and pear, which now are giving fantastic fruit in the late summer and through the autumn. 2021 has produced a particularly bumper crop, and both I and one of my neighbours have enjoyed gathering the windfalls and using them for cooking and putting things in our freezers. Many of the apples, in fact most of them from one particular tree, are actually over 500 grams, which is £1 or just over £1. And I have been making a lot of things like cornbread in a skillet, incorporating wild blackberries and my homegrown apples. I developed herbaceous borders using the dry stone walls that were already on the property as backdrops, and at the front I added in limestone flags. This has made a wonderful seating area, and it's just the most perfect place for looking out at the view or for sitting, contemplating, having a glass of wine, chatting with friends. It's only when I look back over some of the original pictures I can see how far the property has come. This used to be a field, and while many of my friends did see where I was going with the property, a lot of people thought it was a lot of work. For me, doing this renovation, and it's ongoing, with an old house you always have to have ongoing renovations and work, it was always a labour of love, never a chore. How and when did I become introduced to the wonderful technique that is known as wet felting? In 2007, I was joint organiser of a not-for-profit event called the Irish Green Gathering. We were promoting sustainability and the environment in all sorts of different ways, and that was where I had my introduction to felt making. I still have my first ever piece of felt. This was made during a workshop at the festival facilitated by Carmen Sanchez Padron. Carmen is now a really good friend of mine, and amazingly, we only live about 7 minutes drive from each other in the rural community. I'm in County Carlow, she's over the border in County Wexford in Southeast Ireland. So this first piece was very brightly coloured. I had to select from fibre that Carmen had with her, and as you can see, I worked in green, white and orange. All my early pieces of felt were made in colour, using a selection of commercially dyed fibre and also hand-dyed fibre that I used to pick up when I was abroad teaching at different fibre festivals. Since childhood, I've been a scavenger. I absolutely love finding little treasures wherever I'm going. Nothing pleases me more than spending time in a thrift store, an op shop, charity shop, and seeing what I can find. The washers in this felt necklace came from my neighbour's farmyard. I found them just thrown aside in the side of one of his sheds. All my life, I have been in love with trees. I was very fortunate to be able to buy land surrounding my house and garden, and in 2009, 2 years after I started felting, I planted 13,500 trees on the property. These were a combination of 1 acre of pedunculate oak with some birch and Scots pine behind the house, 1 acre, just over 1 acre of ash down at the bottom of my front field, and 6.5 acres of ash towards the back of the property. Where and when did I become introduced to eco-printing? While in Portugal, Facilitating a felting retreat in 2012, I met Taria Kwong from Hong Kong. Taria has become a really good friend of mine. In fact, she's visited Ireland and I visited her twice in Hong Kong. She introduced me to eco-printing. This is a simple technique, but can produce extremely complex results. Felt, fabric or paper is wrapped up with vegetation, and with the process that I use most often called by others a dirty pot, I work without using any powdered mordants, the traditional metal salts used to fix colour on textiles. If this is something that interests you, I've got a short little YouTube video explaining more about this process. I harness the actual composition of my processing pots to modify the colour of the prints that I achieve and also to make them more colour fast. This means that I actually work with limited vegetation, but it doesn't mean that I can't get some really bright and colourful results. Also, some are deep, dark and brooding. The bundles that have come out of this, my largest wood-fired pot, which is cast iron inside, they look very, very dark at my feet. But once I unroll them and open them, the prints that are revealed inside are so much brighter and vibrant than one would expect from seeing the dark colour at the outside. These particular ones are printed using a selection of my own homegrown vegetation that is all here on the property. And that darker mark at the top of this piece is where the rusty metal pipe was in direct contact with the fabric in the bundle. The years progressed and the 13,500 trees continued to grow. This image here shows the plot of pedunculate oak behind the house with some mixed species of birch and Scots pine. I added a selection of eucalyptus trees in the garden behind the house in the piece of land that's actually just below that plot of oak. Eucalyptus trees really love our mild temperate climate with plenty of rain. They grew very quickly and I soon had a plentiful supply of different shaped leaves for my eco printing pot. While not every individual variety of eucalyptus will give red prints, many of them do, and I find this particularly pleasing on felt. Here are a selection of more recent pieces that are all printed using homegrown vegetation. I just find it fascinating how a leaf that can look so blue or so green can produce this most intense and amazing red looking dye colour. It's quite fascinating. Everything has not always been plain sailing, however. Disaster struck. In January 2018, all the ash had to be felled. Sadly, they succumbed to an imported disease called charla or Ash Dieback, and it was absolutely devastating seeing thousands and thousands of trees getting chopped down. Ultimately, there was a very big upside. Not only did I have timber to fuel my wood-fired boiler to heat the house, but I got a reconstitution grant from our Department of Agriculture to replant the area, and finally I was allowed a lot more mixed species. So 6.5 acres now is a combination of trees that I selected for biodiversity and also their usefulness in the eco-printing pot. I have things like hazel, alder, spindle, cherry, Spanish chestnut, rowan or mountain ash, and all the trees are growing really well. The planting was done in June 2018, and these next video clips show how much the trees have grown in the last couple of years. I'm just heading up to the upper plot so that I can show you where I've planted the majority of my deciduous trees. There's 6.5 acres of oak and mixed species up to the highest point of my land, whereas just below me here, behind this stone wall, the dry stone wall, which is the vernacular architecture built heritage of this particular region, I have my original oak with a few mixed species. So there would be some birch and some Scots pine here. This particular plot went in November of 2009. We're now at the end of February 2021. So for quite a number of years, I couldn't actually see these trees over the top of the wall. And about 2.5 years ago, the tips of the oak were above the wall, and in the last 2.5 growing seasons, I cannot believe how tall they are. So never think that trees are not going to grow, even slower growing ones like oak. You need to just put them in and actually go for it. I mean, there are a lot of other species that grow very, very much quicker, but it's so rewarding to plant deciduous trees, provide a haven for wildlife, and just have the beauty and pleasure of watching them change through the seasons. So we're going to go through the gate here next. I'm going to show you the upper plot, which is looking very dormant at the moment, but in another few weeks it's going to be bursting with leaves. Welcome to the upper plot. It's behind me now, and this is the area that I had initially planted with ash, 6.5 acres of ash in this particular plot. And because of Charla, or the Ash Dieback disease, these all had to come out and the whole area had to be replanted. It was absolutely devastating at the time, but in fact, from the perspective of biodiversity and eco-printing, it was actually of ultimate benefit to me. At the time when I initially planted the trees, I was only given permission for monoculture in this plot, which was ash. Whereas when I went, I was able to get a reconstitution grant because the Department of Agriculture said all the trees had to come out, and I was really, really lucky. I now have 70% oak in this plot, but 30% mixed species. I have hazel, I have alder, spindle, I have things like cherry, which the birds absolutely love. And I tried to put as many plants in, as many trees in, as I knew would give me good colour in the dye pot. So I also have Spanish chestnut, and I'm looking forward to having nuts in the very distant future from them to eat, sweet chestnuts, and also hazel from the hazel, and hopefully the birds will enjoy the cherry from the cherries. So while it was a big loss and a big devastation to have to actually take the ash trees out in the first place, this plot behind me, which does look very, very young and juvenile now, and we're at the end of February and there are no leaves on the trees, another few weeks and this will be absolutely bursting with leaf, and it's incredible how quickly it will grow. Over and out from the upper plot. I'd just like to share one little secret with you that I don't really tell many people unless they visit me here, but there's actually the most extraordinary one-roomed little old house here. And this little house and a very, very small field is just up the lane from the bend where I can go into my upper land, unless I walk up through the fields obviously. And this particular little house, up until the 50s, housed a family of 8 people, up until the 1950s. Now a local farmer uses it. He sometimes has rams, or there could be ewes in there that are about to yean. So there's just this little fold of land and one little house. It's here at the lane leading down to Clasheen, and in fact if I walk up here you can see some of his ewes. We say yo here in this region rather than you, and if you said you people would think you weren't really from the farming community. Developing the garden at Clasheen has been an ongoing process. As well as the replanting of trees in 2018, it was a very big year for another reason. I decided to clear a section of the garden at the back of the house and for the first time ever have a proper dedicated felting and eco-printing studio. Once the ground was cleared, a membrane went down with some aggregate on top, and then I used a very, very interesting interlocking tile, for want of a better word, actually developed by the American Army. These are made from recycled plastic, and rather than a big hard foundation, these lock together and they can be moved at a later date. They provided a firm and stable base for the wood shed with the metal roof to sit on. So this was at the end of the autumn, the beginning of the winter 2018. Over the winter, the studio was painted on the outside, and then I used sheep's wool insulation for the inside. I wanted this to be as warm as possible, but also not to be too hot in the summer months. Once the wool insulation was installed, it was then covered and sealed very well before it was painted. And I wanted to paint both the floor and the walls and have this as a little space where I could potentially have an exhibition in the future. By January 2019, I was ready to use it myself and ready for my first workshops. While I was facilitating a workshop abroad in the spring of 2019, a friend laid out wooden edging for the borders, and when I came home, I spent quite a long time digging out all the stones and all the weeds by hand. It took quite a bit of time to get the bottom of the beds as clean as I possibly could, because I garden organically without insecticides or pesticides. But once I had it ready, another friend came with his tractor and we put some of the topsoil back in that had come out from underneath the shed. I drove my truck to Caherhurley Organic Nursery and brought back a large selection of beautiful organic herbaceous plants. And these, along with plants that had been gifts from friends, things I had propagated myself, and just a few seedlings from the front of the house, these all went in the borders on the 4th and 5th of July 2019. It's difficult to express how excited I felt when I had the borders planted and I could see the shape of things to come in the future. I had a garden studio off the grid to work in, and I had my own vegetation surrounding me. By the end of August, it was very easy to see that the plants were enjoying their new home. I did water them copiously. At the beginning from the tap, I have my own well water, but since then I've actually added in rainwater harvesting, and I'm taking the water from the studio roof, also from the house. The plants overwintered very well, and then in February 2020, my friend Anne-Charlotte Fonselius arrived from Sweden bearing a gift of the most wonderful weld plants. These had come from a Norwegian strain and they were imported legally into Ireland. So I was absolutely ecstatic to help her, and we planted them in one of the lower borders. Early in the spring of 2020, worldwide, we were hit with COVID-19. Although I had actually been teaching and working in the studio myself at the beginning of the year, this now meant that I was in a very, very different situation. I took huge pleasure from the garden and outdoors, as I always would do, but I was able to concentrate on writing new online workshops because all my international workshops and Irish workshops were cancelled for the foreseeable future. Developing the borders, seeing everything growing was a real pleasure. It's wonderful to be outside when things are tough because there's such simple pleasure from the sights, the sounds and the smells of the outdoors and from a garden. As hoped, the flowers that I was able to use and the dye plants that I could use in the studio also were a haven for insects and wildlife. Bees, birds, beautiful butterflies, all sorts of different insects, plenty of flying insects. And I even had a badger early in the year, although interestingly enough, not late in the year. So the flowers really grew. Extraordinary to think that at this stage they have only been planted for 1 year. This is the summer of 2020 that you're looking at now. And by the end of the summer, when lockdown eased slightly, I was able to have friends visit. And here's a photo of us. The flowers were actually taller than us. And we had a beautiful evening out enjoying all the sights, sounds and smells with a glass of wine. Throughout 2021, the borders have continued to develop and fill out. Highlights have been the very first sighting of a hummingbird hawk moth, which unfortunately I wasn't able to capture a good photo of, and a really beautiful painted lady butterfly. It's just marvellous to see the biodiversity that this naturalistic planting is attracting. When the lower plot of land was replanted, I was very lucky and able to plant approximately 900 eucalypts of mixed species. This was really fantastic because obviously by this stage I knew how fantastic they would be in the eco-printing pot. Although some of them were really only plugs and several inches tall when they went in, they too have thrived in this moist, temperate climate. Eucalypts themselves don't support much biodiversity, but the undergrowth does. This here is the field the first summer when the eucalyptus were in, and it was just a mass of blooms. There are butterflies, loads of hedgehogs, really interesting insects like this shield bug. And I just love hearing the bird song and seeing the different insects, butterflies, etc. when I'm out walking down the land. Even for me, and I'm used to watching these trees grow, it's very difficult to comprehend that these have not been growing for 3 years here now. They're towering over me, and I have a copious supply of beautiful leaves to use in the eco-printing pot. I hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into the development of my textile practice at Clasheen. Please hit subscribe and the bell now if you're interested in future updates, mini tutorials, etc. from my studio at Clasheen. Over and out for now, and I look forward to seeing you on another occasion.